Psalm 23 was never asking for protection. It was declaring an identity you were never taught to inhabit. The moment you turned it into a plea, you stepped out of the state where nothing can be taken from you. What if your hunger has been proof you've been standing outside the gate praying to get in? There is a quiet terror that lives beneath success, the fear that it can vanish without warning. You can walk through green fields and still brace for loss, because safety was never installed in your inner world. Somewhere early, the soul learned a brutal rule: nothing is given unless you fight for it. So the nervous system stays armed, even in abundance, mistaking ease for danger. The Lord is my shepherd was never meant to soothe that tension, it exposes it. Not a request, a location, a psychological climate where pursuit ends and provision no longer feels invasive. But most people read it while standing in the opposite state, wondering why goodness never stays. If prosperity follows consciousness, what happens when your identity has been built on vigilance instead of being kept? There is a wound so normalized that it masquerades as strength. It learned to speak early before language, before memory could form a defense. It whispered, "Stay alert." It tightened the chest. It sharpened the eyes. It trained the body to scan every room for exits, every joy for its expiration date. And you called this maturity. You called it responsibility. You called it wisdom earned through pain. But it was never wisdom. It was fear that learned to wear a crown. Somewhere in the architecture of your inner world, worth became conditional. Not declared, not inherent, conditional. You learned, slowly, brutally, that safety came after effort, not before. That rest was a reward, not a ground. That if you ever stopped moving, stopped striving, stopped proving, something essential would be taken: love, money, health, dignity, time. So even when abundance arrived, it arrived as a threat. Notice this: the moment something good settles in your life, something in you tightens, the jaw sets, the shoulders lift. A subtle readiness floods the nervous system, as if prosperity were an intruder that needed monitoring. You don't receive it, you manage it. You don't inhabit it, you guard it. This is the hidden contradiction. You say you want peace, but your identity is built on vigilance. You say you want prosperity, but your nervous system is loyal to struggle. And so success never feels safe. It feels temporary, fragile, borrowed. You may have noticed how hard it is to enjoy what you've earned, how joy is quickly followed by calculation, how gratitude is followed by contingency planning, how the mind rehearses loss even while the hands are full. This is not because you are ungrateful. It is because somewhere deep you equated being worthy with being prepared for disaster. The tragedy is subtle. You don't sabotage success by losing it. You sabotage it by never letting it land. And Psalm 23, read from this inner climate, becomes a lullaby you sing to yourself while standing guard. The Lord is my shepherd becomes a plea whispered by someone who does not feel shepherded. I shall not want becomes aspirational, not factual, a hope. Someday. But notice the ache that follows, because the words describe a world your body does not recognize as real. This is the fracture, not between you and God, between you and being kept. And the most devastating part is this: you learned to call this fracture responsibility. You learned to call it humility. You learned to call it realism. Yet beneath all of it lives a silent exhaustion. The exhaustion of always being on watch. The exhaustion of never standing down. The exhaustion of believing that if you don't hold it together, nothing else will. And so prosperity feels invasive. Ease feels suspicious. Stillness feels unsafe. Because stillness was never where you learned to survive. Look closely, without flinching. Every time something begins to work, every time momentum builds, every time life softens its grip just a little, there is a reflex, almost imperceptible, a tightening, a bracing. It is the reflex of someone who believes that what is given can be revoked without warning, that the universe is generous only when watched closely, that goodness must be supervised. This belief does not live in thought. It lives in muscle, in breath, in posture. You may pray for abundance while your body rehearses scarcity. You may speak affirmations while your nervous system prepares for loss. You may declare faith while your identity remains stationed at the edge of danger. And here is the unbearable recognition. This vigilance once saved you. There was a time when staying alert was the difference between emotional survival and collapse, when anticipating loss softened the blow, when expecting disappointment gave you the illusion of control. And so the system learned, never relax first. But the child who needed that strategy grew into an adult who never left the battlefield. Now, even in moments of peace, the system scans. Even in moments of joy, the mind calculates. Even in moments of provision, the heart braces. This is why rest feels unearned. This is why receiving feels undeserved. This is why prosperity never feels like home. Because home was never modeled as safe. Psalm 23 names a state where the battle is already over. But you learn to live as if the war were eternal. So when you hear, "He makes me lie down in green pastures," something in you resists. Lying down feels like exposure. Green pastures feel temporary, and being made to rest feels like a threat to the identity that survived by staying ready. The contradiction tightens further. You long to be kept, but you trust only what you control, and control is expensive. It costs presence, it costs joy, it costs the ability to feel held. So you keep asking for signs, you keep asking for reassurance, you keep asking for protection, not realizing that the asking itself reveals the state you're standing in. And this is the quiet collapse, not dramatic, not loud, but constant, because no matter how much you gain, you never feel safe enough to stop. No matter how much you receive, you never feel certain it will stay. No matter how many prayers you whisper, something in you remains unconvinced. And so the soul grows tired, tired of hoping, tired of bracing, tired of waiting for the other shoe to drop. This is not a failure of faith. It is a failure of identity. You were taught to believe that worth must be defended, that safety must be earned, that being kept is something that happens after vigilance proves itself. And as long as that belief remains intact, every blessing will feel like a test you might fail. There is a law that was never announced, no commandments carved into stone, no sermons thundered from pulpits. It works silently, like gravity, like atmosphere, like temperature. You don't believe it into existence, you stand inside it. And this is where the betrayal begins, because everything you were taught trained you to ask, to petition, to plead, to negotiate with the unseen as if reality were a reluctant authority figure withholding approval. But Psalm 23 does not speak that language. It does not ask to be led. It does not request provision. It does not hope for safety. It declares a state. The Lord is my shepherd is not theology. It is orientation, a declaration of inner territory. Not God, please shepherd me, but I am shepherded. And the difference between those two is not semantic, it is existential. Because consciousness does not respond to requests, it responds to location. Imagine standing in winter and asking for warmth. The asking does nothing. Only relocation does. You do not negotiate with climate, you enter it. This is the invisible law. Consciousness functions as environment, not effort. Your inner state is not a thought, it is a weather system. And life does not argue with weather. It conforms to it. When your identity is tuned to vigilance, life mirrors instability. When your identity is tuned to being kept, life reorganizes around continuity. This is not reward, this is resonance. And this is where the old beliefs fracture. You were taught that effort creates outcomes, that striving earns security, that vigilance protects what you love. But effort does not create stability. Identity does. You can work endlessly from a state of scarcity and never feel full. You can receive endlessly from a state of vigilance and never feel safe, because the mirror does not respond to motion. It responds to position. Psalm 23 is a map of position. He restores my soul does not describe an action in time. It describes a condition of being where restoration is constant, automatic, ambient, like oxygen. I shall not want is not optimism. It is physics within that state. Want disappears not because desire is punished, but because lack cannot survive in that climate. This is why reading the psalm while standing outside the state feels hollow, The words describe a room you are not yet in, and the body knows it. So the mind turns it into a prayer, because asking feels safer than relocating. Asking preserves identity. Relocation dissolves it, and dissolution feels like death. Because vigilance is not just a habit, it is a self built in shadow, a self that learned to survive by anticipating loss, a self that believes being on guard is the price of staying alive. To step into a state where you are kept feels like betrayal of your history, of your coping, of the version of you that endured. So instead, you keep asking, not realizing that the asking keeps you outside. Here is the part no one tells you. States are self-sealing. Once you inhabit one, everything inside it feels logical, justified, even moral. Vigilance calls itself wisdom. Struggle calls itself virtue. Control calls itself responsibility, and any alternative feels naive, dangerous, unreal. So when Psalm 23 names a reality where goodness follows you, not chases you, not must be earned by pursuit, but follows you like a shadow of light, something in you resists. Because in the state of vigilance, nothing follows, everything must be tracked. But in the state of being kept, pursuit ends. And pursuit ending feels like disappearance to an identity built on effort. This is the polarity. Two climates, two identities, two mirrors. One says, if I stop, I lose. The other says, because I am, nothing is lost. One scans for threat. The other assumes continuity. One prays for protection. The other exists as protection. And the invisible law is mercilessly neutral. It does not judge which state you choose. It simply reflects it. So long as you read Psalm 23 as hope, you remain outside it. So long as you speak it as a future, it stays there. Because states are not accessed through time. They are accessed through identity. This is why affirmations fail. They try to change the mirror without moving the body. This is why effort exhausts you. It attempts to force outcomes while staying in the same climate. And this is why prosperity has always felt fragile. You were trying to bring abundance into a state that could not hold it, like ice trying to host fire. The psalm was never a spell. It was a signpost. It did not promise to change the world. It named the world you would see once you changed where you were standing, and now the tension sharpens. Because if this is true, if consciousness is climate, if identity is location, then the question is no longer, how do I get what I want? The question becomes far more dangerous. Where am I standing right now? If something in you has gone quiet while listening to this, not calm, quiet. If a part of you feels exposed as if a light has been turned on inside a room you've kept sealed for years, then you already know this is not information, it's recognition, and recognition is never passive. There is a moment, rare, fragile, when consciousness hovers between states, when the old climate loosens its grip just enough for another atmosphere to be felt. Not entered, just felt. This is that moment. And moments like this either collapse back into familiarity or they are sealed by declaration. Not affirmation, not promise. Declaration. Because states respond to movement, not contemplation. So if this is landing somewhere deeper than thought, if your body feels it before your mind agrees, then do not let this pass as background noise. Make it real, like the video, not as approval, as alignment. Comment below, not to speak to me, but to speak from the state that is beginning to stir. Subscribe to the channel, not to consume more, but to declare continuity with this frequency. Say it out loud, type it with your hands. Let your nervous system witness you choosing resonance over retreat, because the smallest embodied action can anchor a state more powerfully than hours of reflection. And this, right here, is not about a platform. It is about whether you let this moment close or whether you step forward without knowing what comes next. The shift is not an action. That is the first shock. It does not respond to discipline. It cannot be scheduled. It cannot be perfected. And because of that, it threatens everything you were taught about growth. You were trained to believe that change requires effort, that something must be done for movement to occur, that if you are not actively working, improving, fixing, or correcting, you are falling behind. That stillness is decay disguised as peace, So when the idea of a shift that requires no effort appears, the mind rejects it instantly, not because it is false, but because it is destabilizing. The shift is not about becoming more capable. It is about no longer needing to be capable to feel safe, and that is unbearable to the identity that survived by staying sharp. For most of your life, effort was protection, awareness was armor, control was love. You learned, quietly, unconsciously, that if you relaxed first, something would be lost. That ease invited punishment, that safety was temporary and must be guarded. So your body learned to live in a forward tilt, always leaning, always anticipating, always slightly ahead of the present moment. Even when you rested, part of you stayed awake. Even when you laughed, part of you watched. Even when you succeeded, part of you waited for the reversal. This posture became so normal that you stopped noticing it, until now. Because the shift does not announce itself as comfort. It announces itself as disorientation. The moment you stop leaning forward, the system panics, not loudly, internally, a tightening in the chest, a shallow breath, a sudden urge to check, fix, plan, or prepare. The mind calls it intuition, but it is not intuition. It is withdrawal. The withdrawal symptoms of an identity addicted to vigilance. The shift asks you to remain still inside that sensation, not to correct it, not to analyze it, not to spiritualize it, just to not move back into the familiar posture. This is where the difficulty lies, because the shift does not feel like progress. It feels like exposure. Without vigilance, who protects you? Without anticipation, who prevents disaster? Without effort, who earns permission to exist? These questions are not philosophical. They are somatic. They rise from the body like alarms. And this is why the shift cannot be taught as a method. Because methods give the vigilant self something to do. This shift takes something away. It removes the job. And without the job, the identity trembles. For a moment, sometimes only seconds, you experience something deeply unfamiliar. Nothing needs your immediate intervention. The world does not collapse. The floor does not give way. The future does not rush toward you with punishment. There is no reward either, just neutrality. And neutrality feels empty to a nervous system trained on urgency. This is why the shift is often abandoned, because emptiness feels like danger when your life was built on intensity. But if you do not rearm, if you do not lean forward again, something begins to loosen, not relief, not peace, suspension. A pause in the endless internal bracing. And in that pause, a question forms, not in words, but in sensation. What if I am already being held? The mind rejects it immediately, but the body hesitates, and that hesitation is the doorway. The hesitation does not last long. Vigilance is loyal. It returns quickly. It reminds you of every time relaxing led to pain. Every moment ease was followed by loss. Every instance where trusting cost you something, and it has evidence, real evidence. So the system tightens again. The forward lean returns. The subtle clenching resumes. This is not failure. This is conditioning. The shift was never meant to be permanent at first. It was meant to be noticed, because once you notice the difference between leaning and not leaning, you can never fully forget it. The body now knows there are two climates, one where everything must be managed, one where management briefly stops and the world remains. That knowing is dangerous, because it weakens the belief that vigilance is necessary for survival, and the identity built on necessity does not surrender easily. So the shift remains incomplete, hovering. You may feel it late at night when the future loosens its grip, or early in the morning before the mind reasserts control, or in moments of beauty that silence the internal narrator. It appears and disappears, and every time it disappears, something mourns, because something tasted a different way of standing. The shift does not promise you abundance. It does not promise protection. It does not promise outcomes. It removes the posture of pursuit. And without pursuit, you begin to sense how exhausted you've been. This exhaustion is not physical, it is existential. The exhaustion of always standing guard. The shift lets that exhaustion surface. And exhaustion is not glamorous, it is heavy, it is quiet, it is uncelebrated. Which is why this stage feels like loss, not gain. You are losing the identity that knew how to survive. And nothing has replaced it yet, so you hover. Between states, between climates, between the one who leans forward and the one who stands still long enough to feel the ground. And there is no instruction for what comes next. Only this unresolved pressure, this incomplete pivot, this sense that something fundamental has moved, but not enough to name. When the shift begins to take root, not fully, not cleanly, but enough, you start to notice something unsettling. You are no longer oriented toward survival in the same way. This does not arrive as confidence. It does not feel like empowerment. It does not feel victorious. It feels like the removal of a constant internal pressure. And pressure was familiar. Pressure gave shape to your days. It organized your priorities. It told you who you were. Without it, something feels missing, not empty, undefined. You begin to realize that much of your identity was built against something, against loss, against humiliation, against instability, against disappearance. Your personality was a response. Your ambition was a defense. Your discipline was a shield. Your vigilance was a strategy. And strategies create identities. But identities built on threat cannot survive in climates where threat is no longer central. So something begins to loosen. You do not react as quickly anymore. You do not rush to fill silence. You do not over-explain your choices. And this unsettles people, because they were used to your readiness, your reliability, your constant availability. They were used to you leaning forward. Now you hesitate, not from fear, from neutrality. And neutrality is disarming. It does not compete. It does not chase. It does not justify. It simply is. This is where the identity begins to fracture, because if you are no longer driven by the need to secure safety, what drives you? If you are no longer proving worth through effort, what defines worth? If you are no longer scanning for threat, what do you pay attention to? These questions do not produce answers. They produce silence. And silence is dangerous to identities built on noise. So the old self protests. It calls this laziness, complacency, spiritual bypassing. It warns you that you are becoming careless. But look closely. You are not careless, you are unhooked. You still act, you still choose, you still move. But the movement is no longer fueled by panic. It arises from coherence. And coherence feels dull to a nervous system addicted to urgency. So the identity feels flat. And that flatness feels like loss. You grieve without realizing it. You grieve the version of yourself that knew how to fight. You grieve the sharpness that kept you alive. You grieve the intensity that gave you meaning. Because intensity was proof that you mattered. Without it, you are faced with something terrifying. Existence without justification. Being without explanation. Presence without performance. This is the beginning of the new identity. And it does not feel empowering. It feels exposed. As this identity reorganizes, something subtle but profound occurs. You stop treating stability as something fragile. You no longer assume that good things require constant supervision. When something works, you do not immediately wait for the failure. When something arrives, you do not grip it tightly. And when something leaves, it hurts, but it does not dismantle you. This is new, because previously, loss meant confirmation. Confirmation that vigilance was necessary, confirmation that trust was dangerous, confirmation that ease was temporary. Now, loss feels different. It feels sad, but not meaningful in the same way. It no longer defines you, and that is destabilizing, because suffering once gave your story coherence. Without it, the narrative loosens. You no longer know how to explain yourself. You do not know how to summarize who you are becoming. And this frustrates the mind. The mind wants identity to be describable. But this identity is environmental. It is not a role, it is not a self-image, it is not a personality upgrade. It is a standing. You are standing inside provision instead of chasing it. You are standing inside continuity instead of preparing for rupture. And because of that, your presence changes. Not louder, not more charismatic, quieter, more opaque, less reactive. And opacity is often mistaken for withdrawal, but it is not withdrawal, it is containment. You are no longer leaking energy through anticipation. You are no longer explaining yourself to absence. You are no longer trying to outrun uncertainty, and this feels dangerous to the old self. Because the old self believed that effort was protection. Without effort, what protects you? There is no answer yet, only experience. Moments where nothing collapses, moments where ease does not punish you, moments where goodness does not demand repayment. These moments accumulate quietly, and the identity continues to shift, not into something heroic, but into something stable. Yet this stability is not secure. It can be abandoned. It can be overridden. Vigilance is patient. It waits for stress, for loss, for surprise, and when it returns, it will offer familiarity, which is why this identity cannot be claimed. It must be noticed, again and again and again. You are not finished. You are not safe. You are not enlightened. You are simply no longer who you were. And the space between those two identities remains charged, unresolved, alive. There is a moment, and it does not arrive with certainty, when you realize you are no longer waiting for something to happen. Not because everything is complete, not because the future feels safe, but because the internal posture of waiting for danger has loosened. It is subtle, so subtle that you might miss it if you are still looking for transformation to announce itself loudly. It feels like the absence of a question you have asked your whole life, the question of when. When will it fall apart? When will it be taken? When will the cost arrive? That question does not get answered. It simply stops repeating. And the silence it leaves behind is disorienting. Because the question gave rhythm to your days, it gave shape to your thoughts, it justified your vigilance. Without it, time stretches strangely. Moments feel wider. You may find yourself standing still without checking the future, sitting without planning your escape, breathing without correcting the breath, and something in you panics, not because something is wrong, but because nothing is demanding your readiness. You have lived so long inside anticipation that its absence feels like a void. But this void does not pull you downward. It does not collapse you. It simply waits. And waiting without threat is unfamiliar territory. You may try to name it: peace, trust, faith. But the names do not stick, because this is not an emotion. It is not relief. It is a climate, a background condition that does not ask for attention. It surrounds you whether you engage with it or not. You begin to notice that goodness no longer feels dramatic. It does not arrive with fireworks. It does not feel like winning. It simply remains. And because it remains, it stops needing to prove itself. This is deeply unsettling to a self raised on contrast. You were taught to recognize good by the pain that preceded it, to value safety by the danger that almost took it away. Without contrast, the nervous system feels bored, and boredom feels threatening. So vigilance whispers. It reminds you that this could be temporary, that this calm could be deceptive, that you should prepare just in case. And maybe you will. Maybe tomorrow you will lean forward again. Maybe the old posture will return under stress. Maybe you will forget this state entirely. But something has already happened that cannot be undone. You have felt what it is like to stand without bracing, and once felt, it becomes a reference point, not an achievement, a memory in the body. Our knowing that returns uninvited, late at night, in moments of beauty, in the middle of ordinary days when nothing goes wrong, and each time it returns, it brings the same quiet realization. Nothing is chasing you, not lack, not punishment, not the need to earn your place, and goodness does not pursue you either. It follows, not closely, not anxiously, like something that knows where you are without needing to watch. This understanding does not ask you to agree with it. It does not ask you to believe. It simply waits for you to notice when you are standing inside it. You may step out of this state again. You may return to vigilance. You may rebuild the old identity when life demands sharpness. That is not failure. States are not moral. But now, when you lean forward, something in you will remember what it feels like not to, and that memory will quietly question the necessity of your effort. Not today, not dramatically, but eventually. And that is where this ends. not with clarity, not with certainty, but with a lingering sense that the gate was never locked and that you were never meant to force it open, only to notice when you were already standing inside.